My cousin Jeanne and I were born just a few weeks apart. I think our parents always expected us to be best friends since birth, but unfortunately that never happened. Jeanne was gross. I'm not saying that to be mean, or because she was ugly. In fact, she was a much cuter kid than me before she started picking up her awful habits at a very young age. Jeanne eats too fucking much. Anything, everything, all the time, everywhere. My parents stopped letting her stay at our house when we were 4 because Jeanne ate the handles off all our pans. Her parents had to move to an apartment because she would eat the whole garden. Flowers, rocks, dirt, worms, everything. She wasn't allowed to have pets because more than once she was found trying to chew on the cat's head. The only reason why the poor animal survived was because it scratched her face all over. Jeanne's sister, Layla, even told me that their parents had to lock Jeanne in her bedroom during sleep hours because of incidents. For example, more than once she was found looming over one of them in the middle of the night, eating their hair. The most uncanny part was that she was never sick after eating all these things and more. Our relatives and even some neighbors who got caught up in this mess tried to intervene and beg her parents to get her proper treatment, but it all fell on deaf ears. My Aunt Cara was somewhat reasonable, but my Uncle Jeff didn't believe in sending his precious little monster to a rehab or at least a spa. In this family, we'd take care of our own, he stated. And she would eat the bed and table anyway. It would only trouble other people, my aunt added. Needless to say, my own parents ended up cutting them off almost completely. Luckily for us, they ended up moving out to a bigger city when Jeanne and I were around 9. For years, our only contact was a phone call on Christmas and nothing more. We avoided asking unpleasant questions about Jeanne. As a broke college student, however, I ended up having to count on them to get a part-time job when I started my graduation. After all, I didn't know anyone else in the city, and no other place I applied was so understanding of my schedule. Uncle Jeff and Aunt Cara welcomed me with open arms to work on their arts and crafts store. It was a family business in expansion, so they asked me to help take care of the finances, as my uncle was getting old and prone to making mistakes. My cousin Jeanne was working there. When I first arrived in the store, I barely recognized her. She was only a little chubby. No one in our family was exactly thin, so I thought that her eating disorder was finally under control. Only one day with Jeanne as my coworker was enough to find out that her eating habits were still as gross as ever. She was working mostly in the storage room, but sometimes my aunt and my older cousin Layla would call her up to the storefront to ask something. It was clear that it was an excuse to keep an eye on her. Jeanne was a sloppy worker. She mucked the storage room with ketchup, dirty dishware, and who knows what else. And she would absolutely be fired if she wasn't the daughter of the owners. Still, my uncle and aunt insisted that she had to be where they could see her. How can Jeanne be so thin? I asked Layla during a break. Now that our age gap of 3 years was insignificant, we were quickly becoming good friends. I've been dying to know. Over the last year, she's been obese and then normal over 6 times. She always takes 3 days off and then comes back this way, like her body was only a fat suit. Then she eats until she gets super fat again. I was intrigued, but didn't say anything. I observed and was disgusted by what I saw. My cousin's food compulsion was worse than ever. She has to be always munching on something or she'd immediately start to eat objects. I considered calling the police, but I just couldn't betray my uncle and aunt who had been so generous to me. I was still looking for another job, but couldn't find anything. The weeks went by. Jeanne was always late, with sticky fingers, stained clothes, and bad breath. She was a walking train wreck, and even Aunt Cara was starting to agree with Layla that getting professional help was the only way, if there was one. But you know, she has this friend who does that amazing massage, so she can actually eat a little more than us, I overheard my aunt saying. A little more than us was a whole lot of sugarcoating for an adult woman who ate a box of pens because one of her many deliveries was 10 minutes late. So that's a massage? Layla asked. Aunt Cara then explained that Jeanne was vague about it and that she was trying to respect her privacy. I couldn't believe any of this. Then, less than 3 months after I started working with my relatives, I saw it with my own eyes. On a Friday, Jeanne was easily weighing over 400 pounds. Then she came back the next Tuesday with no more than 150. She wasn't exactly thin, but compared to a body with endless folds that she could barely move around, She looked great, healthy, normal. It was pretty clear that she didn't undergo some mysterious surgery because she had no scars, no loose skin, nothing. I started to obsess over her method. I begged her to take me to her masseuse. Besides being deadly curious, I'd love to lose around 15 pounds. "Don't be a wimp. You'd have to gain at least 200 pounds to make it worth," she simply replied, sipping on what I thought to be a family-sized cup of soda, but it was actually melted cheese. I was losing my mind over her lifestyle. I had an anxiety attack every time I had to see Jeanne eating, and sometimes I followed her to her house after work just to see her stopping to grab multiple takeouts, all while snacking in her car. I then watched her having dinner for over 3 hours, then proceeding to snack until bedtime. Jeanne lived in the ground floor because on her worst days her body couldn't fit in the building's escalator, so I could see her from the window. She dined alone, but my uncle and aunt lived on the same building to constantly check on her and sometimes help her when she couldn't get up from the couch on her own. More weeks went by. I seriously considered abandoning college and going back home. It's hard to describe it because it doesn't seem to be that big of an issue, but the stress of having to live with Jeanne's eating disorder was too challenging for me. Every day it was noticeable that she was getting fatter and fatter, and almost 3 months had passed since she came back thin, so I knew that it was close to her next massage. I was having a horrible nightmare with Jeanne chewing on my leg when my phone woke me up. It was Layla. "Aiden, I just asked Mom. Jeanne is taking 3 days off starting today. Do you want to follow her? I'm on my way to your place." Jeanne drove for hours. At first, it was easy to pretend like we were just another vehicle on the highway. Layla borrowed her boyfriend's car, like the mildly skilled detective she was. But then as she drove through small local roads, it became pretty obvious that she was being tailed. My cousin finally stopped by a rural clay pathway leading to nothing more than a small shack. She parked after a semi-truck, then watched as 2 nondescript men grabbed a large box and started unloading it in the front of the shack, on a poor excuse for a lawn. She then painfully got out of her car and started screaming at us. "Dad, if it's you, I swear to God!" Then a woman all covered in a silky hijab opened the door. She moved swiftly, despite her long clothes. She nodded to the 2 men and they entered. The woman then approached Jeanne. "Don't worry, it's just your sister and cousin. She pointed a gloved finger to our black-windowed car with such an authority that made my knees tremble. "Leave at once. Your curiosity is not welcome." We left, defeated. I spent the rest of the weekend packing my stuff, convinced to go back to my parents' house. I didn't go to the uni on Monday. What was the point? And I was considering going to my part-time job only to resign properly. Then Jeanne called me. For some reason, my heart skipped a beat when I saw her name on the screen. "Since you decided to snoop, come over. I'll tell you everything." My whole body trembled and I was pale, so much that my Uber driver asked me thrice if I wanted to change my destination to a hospital. I only shook my head no, unable to convey the words. I heard pacing as I approached Jeanne's apartment, and I didn't need to ring the doorbell to be let in. Jeanne was different, but it took me a few moments to realize how. Her body wasn't just average, it looked really good. "Jeanne, you're hot, I know." She cut me off. "Something went wrong this time. Sit down, loser. You're gonna need it." Jeanne then explained as bluntly as possible that the secret to her weight loss was a ritual. The lady in the silky hijab was able to perform an old sorcery that transferred Jeanne's head and mind to a recently deceased body and merged them in a seamless new form. No murders, though. She has a deal with some guys from the morgue or something. "And what happens to your old body?" I immediately asked. "Yeah, Aiden, that's the problem. It's usually discarded with fire, but this time it still had a little of my mind left on it. It survived. It's pissed. And after me." I don't know how long I spent with my mouth stupidly hanging open, flabbergasted. "Have you told Layla?" was the first thing I managed to ask. "No. She's a snitcher. I don't want Mom and Dad to know. I'm only asking you because you're smart. What should I do?" Well, if fire didn't work, you could probably try acid? Can you get some shit from your uni's lab then? Yes, but only if you let me tell Layla. My loyalty to Layla saved her life. As Jeanne drove us back to the campus, I called my older cousin to fill her in. She might have but answered the phone because I could hear screaming and fighting, while Jeanne's voice, muffled and monstrous, seemed to chant from the other side of the line. No, she wasn't chanting. She was repeating the same phrase over and over. I always wondered how it was like to eat a human whole. When we arrived with a big bucket of nitric acid, Layla was suffocating inside monstrous Jeanne's many layers of fat. It was like a macabre, overinflated, bouncy castle. Both Layla and the bizarre being turned to us as we approached them. The Jeanne that was supposed to be discarded didn't have a face. She was pretty much a giant blob with a sorry excuse of a head, and her voice came from the open wound on her neck, raspy, sickening, deadly. I'm eating you too. Although she didn't have eyes, I felt her staring at me with her very being. Thin Jeanne threw her whole body against monstrous Jeanne and started punching her way in, until she grabbed Layla's arm. Sorry, I'm a terrible sister. Aiden, pull her, she said emotionlessly. I then proceeded to unravel my older cousin from the clutches of certain death, either by suffocation or by having her bones shattered. I'm not particularly strong, so it was more work of will than a work of muscle. Little by little, I freed her. First an arm and her head, then the rest of her body while she kicked and shoved the fat pleats that squeezed her mercilessly. My shoulders hurt so much with the effort, and Layla had both feet pointing at unnatural angles. We were alive, but pretty beaten. All the while, Thin Jeanne was doing a fantastic job in distracting her monstrous self. It was still clinging tightly to Layla, but its pseudo-mouth was too busy to devour her. The two Jeannes were fighting fiercely as I finally freed Layla completely. This Jeanne was winning, but just barely. Just enough to keep her evil self from attacking us. Throw it now, she commanded. It took me a moment to understand what she was asking. The acid. Jeanne told me to shower both of them with it. I'll go help you, I replied, even though I could barely keep standing. Shut up, loser. If you don't do it now, this thing will eat us all, then more people. I'm sorry, Jeanne, I yelled, as I opened the lid and prepared to hurt her badly. Don't. I'm responsible for this, were her last words. The monster let out a terrible cry, then started to fizz and evaporate, letting out an unholy smell. Its whimpers quickly fused with Jeanne's, Layla's, and mine. Layla and I were splashed by the acid and ended up with a lot of small burns. Jeanne didn't make it. Her death was terribly hard on me. After all, despite the circumstances, I was the one to kill her. I dropped out of college and went back to my parents' house. My PTSD, depression, and anxiety soon turned into compulsively eating the whole time. Sometimes I eat small objects without even noticing. Lately I've been so hungry and so fat. I don't know how she does it, but that woman in the silky hijab recently called me. I immediately recognized her voice. She simply told me her price and a date, as I already knew how to find her. My self-esteem is shattered, so I'm going. But I'm worried my ritual goes wrong too, because lately my mouth starts watering whenever I wonder how it's like to eat a human whole.